Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome back to our CEN seminar series. So today we've got a topic concerning emotionally based school avoidance, which is obviously a very pressing topic at the minute in education. So we've got Laura and Nat from the University of York. Nathalie and Laura are both developmental psychologists, and Nathalie leads the Thoughts and Feelings About Bullying research group. Her research interests focus on exploring young people's experiences of bullying and the mechanisms that explain the relationship between being bullied and poor mental health. Meanwhile, Laura is a member of the Genomics and Life Stories research group, and her research centres on inclusive research methods and how individuals with additional needs experience social relationships and the impact that these relationships have on well-being. They're my lovely colleagues from the University of York, and they are going to be telling us about children who hide in schools and why do they do it. So I'll hand over to Laura and Nat.
Thank you, Astrid. I think you should now be able to see slides, hopefully. Wonderful. So I think Nat's going to introduce the first half of the talk, and then we're going to go over what we sort of did and what we found.
So it might bring back COVID memories, I'm afraid, because we're going to do that awkward moment of next slide, please, as we go through. But I'm Nathalie. I'm going to start off our presentation, and Laura, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. So what we're going to try and do today is just give you a bit of an overview of the Hiding in School project that we conducted in York. And in our presentation today, we're going to give you a very brief overview of EBSA, so emotional based school avoidance, and in particular, the specific behaviour of hiding in schools, and we'll explain what that means in a moment. We're then going to talk through what we actually did, our method, our approach to conducting the project, and give you a summary of the findings from the work we did with young people, but also the work we did with teachers around their perceptions of why children and young people hide in school, before ending with some key points of conclusion and discussion and how we can apply the findings to current policy, practice, and some other recommendations as we go through. So hopefully we'll stick to time. We understand that if you've got any questions, please do post them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. Okay, next slide, please, Laura. So emotional based school avoidance really reflects patterns of behaviour where children and young people do not want to attend school or do not want to attend particular lessons. And this can often be due to a range of different mental health issues, issues to do with poor well-being and emotional issues as well. And the Anna Freud Centre produced a really nice guidance document which has really underpinned the way that we've been thinking about EBSA, particularly in terms of the behaviour of hiding in school. And what we mean by that is it doesn't necessarily capture just children who do not attend school, so those who are not physically going onto school property. But when we're talking about hiding in school, we're talking about a particular group of students who attend school, but then do not go into classrooms, or they are hiding in various locations. They may skip particular lessons or particular places within the school setting. So it can capture a range of different types of hiding and avoidance behaviour, but where the children and young people are physically present in the school property. Okay, next slide, please, Laura. So it's really difficult to identify how common and how prevalent this behaviour is. Some of the closest type of statistics that we've found so far are associated with absentee rates, which are published by the UK Education Statistics Group. And sorry, I should have said at the beginning, what we've tried to do as we go through the slides is we've added QR codes into the slides so that you can access the particular reports that we're referring to as we go through. So the latest data in terms of data that was gathered in February of last month, I'm losing track of where we are, suggests that approximately 7% of the student population across England were absent during school. And what the data actually do is break this down by primary school, secondary school, and state-funded special schools. And the data there are presented at the bottom. And what you can see here is that the prevalence of absenteeism is higher in secondary compared to primary school, but also higher in state-funded special schools compared to mainstream schools, both at primary and secondary level. Next slide, please, Laura. So of interest to us, because obviously we come from slightly different research backgrounds, and of interest to us is why are children and young people engaging in this behaviour? Why are they going physically onto school, and why are they then sort of hiding away? And because it's not a behaviour that's been looked at in great detail, we've looked at evidence that is coming from the notion of EBSA more holistically, so those who are absent from school, but also those who are hiding. And there's a really nice document that's been published by West Sussex local authority, which has broken down some of the school factors, family factors, and child factors that influence the behaviour. So what we can see on here is different types of school factors. So it could be peer relationship issues such as friendship, bullying, transitional issues, finding particular subjects and topics difficult, or feeling that particular subjects are too academically demanding, but also associations with particular types of assessments such as exams. They also break down particular family factors and individual child level factors, which could reflect particular dysfunctional family interactions, a family history of EBSA, including family attitudes towards education within there, issues to do with loss and bereavement, but also a higher prevalence in children and young people who also take a young carer role within the family. And then finally, on that individual level, we see there's a higher risk at particular ages, but also reflective of special educational needs and disabilities, reflecting those who may be autistic, but also other learning difficulties as well that may be influential in determining the prevalence of hiding in school. Next slide, please, Laura. So one of the things that is under great debate within the EBSA literature and the literature on attendance more broadly is what has been the influence of COVID. There's an interesting paper by Lester and Michelson that was published in the BMJ just recently, which has suggested again that we've got these school-related and family-related factors, much like the Sussex report, but they're also talking about specific issues to do with COVID. So things about like anxiety related to illnesses related to COVID. There's particular issues to do with cost of living crisis, with strikes, all of these different factors that may influence some of the family related factors and child related factors that were reported in the previous report. So there seems to be lots of different influences playing a role in why children and young people may be avoiding school, may be hiding in school if they actually attend as well. So, sorry, next slide, please, Laura. So what we aim to do, and this came out of a discussion with our local schools, and one of the schools in particular had highlighted to us that they were really feeling that they had an issue at the time, at the start of the project, with children and young people hiding in school. And this was a secondary school in particular. And they came to us and said, would this be something that you'd be interested in researching? And we were, and it started through that conversation of being an engagement with our local schools of a particular issue that they were finding problematic at the time. So what we wanted to do was examine both young people's and teachers' perceptions of why students engage in internal truancy or hiding in school, and try and gather as much information as we can from both the student and the teacher perception as to why this behaviour might happen. In particular, we wanted to look at how and why adolescents find entering and staying in the classroom particularly challenging. So what is going on that means that a child can attend school but not attend a particular lesson or stay in a particular location in school? For these children and young people, what do they perceive to be the benefits of this behaviour? So what are they getting out of it? What is the benefit to them? And then from a teacher perspective, what are the barriers and facilitators for these types of behaviours? How a teacher's perceiving what's going on for the children at this point? Why do they think they're engaging with these behaviours? What makes it easier? What makes it difficult for them to manage, to get a better understanding of how they're managing that behaviour in school? So we were really looking at these three key questions as to what was going on in terms of hiding in school behaviour. Next slide, please, Laura. Excuse me. So in terms of what we did, we had this two-pronged attack where we were working both with young people and with school staff. We worked with 25 young people between 13 and 16 years old in 4 focus groups in schools in York. trying to capture and explore their experiences of finding it difficult to enter and stay in the classroom. These focus groups were really interactive. They included a range of activities to support young people to discuss their experiences, their opinions. There was a persona activity that Laura's going to talk through shortly, alongside activities to do with what are the best and worst ideas that children and young people can think about in terms of managing this behaviour. The young people also completed a quick survey which included questions on why they thought some people struggled, so it was depersonalised, so why did they think people engaged in hiding in school behaviour. The school staff and staff across the UK, we had an online survey running both in York and nationally, where we had a total sample of 219 teachers who completed an online survey exploring why they felt that young people were struggling, why they may engage in internal truancy or hiding in schools, and as I said, what sort of factors do they believe contribute to this. So at this point, Laura, I think it's next slide. And do we swap over? There we go.
So I'm just going to talk you a little bit through sort of what we did and why we did it, and then I'm going to speak to you a little bit about what the young people had to say about this. So apologies, this will be quite small on a laptop screen, but we can always share this later if people are interested. Just to make it slightly more accessible to young people, we had a sort of breakdown of the consent form. They could access the full consent form if they wanted to, but we thought if we just tell them the very quick fire of what it is they are going to be asked to do, it might get them to engage slightly better. We recruited young people on a sort of opportunity basis. So we kind of went into schools, and if there were children who weren't going into class or that were currently engaging in sort of hiding, they were invited to come and sit with us. And we explained what the project was and what it was that we were asking them to do. So like Nat said, as this was sort of happening and young people were coming into the classroom, we got them to sit down and do an individual survey, and then we moved on to the tasks in the focus group setting. There was sort of a quick fire round of what do you think, why do you think people hide, and what do you think might help? So without thinking too much, just whatever first came to mind. They were then asked to create a persona, which I'll explain in a second if people aren't familiar with the method. And then they used that persona to fill in different tasks. So they were thinking about a timeline, for example, of when students might hide in school and which are the pinch points in the day for when this might be the trickiest point for that student. So just before I go over what it is they said, I just want to explain what a persona activity is and why we chose to use it. So personas are used quite a lot in design-based research, and the idea is that they're very good for researching topics that might be sensitive because they give a sense of disassociation from the topic. So you ask young people in groups to fill in this persona about what would the average 15-year-old look like who hides in schools. So it starts off very easy with sort of what's your main hobbies, and then that should in theory get people talking about what the best part of the day is, what the worst part of the day is. And then whilst they're discussing this, what tends to happen is young people then discuss what it is that they also find difficult. And it's just a bit of an icebreaker, and it can mean that those who aren't comfortable talking about their own experiences can portray this in a way that isn't necessarily directly linked to them. So it goes from sort of easy questions, like I said, about hobbies, and then it gets into this nitty-gritty of what it is that we're asking about. So why do you not want to stay in the classroom? What's most likely to help? What's least likely to help? And then what we did from this persona is we asked them if they were comfortable in doing so to use it to complete the rest of the activities. In reality, what tends to happen is they forget about the persona activity and speak about themselves, but it's just a really great way of getting young people who might not be used to taking part in research to feel a bit more comfortable. So I'm going to go over a little bit of what young people said in these focus groups. So I thought I'd just show you some of the completed activities first before I got into the analysis bit. I have redacted any names, but as a slight warning, there is a slightly sweary word on the next slide, but they have kindly asterisked it out. So you'll see here that this is the quickfire bit. So some young people sort of took it into their own hands and colour-coded it. So they wanted to talk about what they didn't like and what they thought would help. But there's a running theme throughout this that's coming up in the EBSA literature. There's lots to do with falling out with people. So breakdowns of relationships, breakdowns with individual teachers, and reluctance to go into classes when they think that they're going to get into trouble. So a lot of the young people we spoke to had teaching staff that they thought just constantly were putting them into isolation for no reason, and then that led to them not wanting to go into that specific class. So okay with coming to school, but not okay with going into specific lessons. This is just a little example of what some of the personas look like, and it started bringing out who they might want to speak to and who they're not wanting to speak to. It's quite small, so I'm really sorry, so I'll read most of it out. But you'll see it starts off with them playing FIFA, so things that this specific group of young people thought was the general hobbies of people who were 15. And then it goes into sort of what do you find hard about classrooms? What do you feel like when you go into the classroom? So, for example, when I leave the classroom, it makes me feel happy and relieved. And then we also asked them to complete where they thought most people went. So you'll see that a lot of them go into toilets, which I think is common across the country for where people are choosing to hide. And surprisingly, a lot of the young people had filled in this persona to say that they tended to go there on their own. So lots of these people were not just going there to hang out with their friends, they were going there because it was somewhere that they wanted to be on their own and have their own space. And this is just an example of how we asked them to plot out their timeline of the day. So we said, could you use your persona to show us sort of when during the day your persona might hide and why, starting from waking up to going to bed. And you'll see that a lot of young people have written across the entire project things to do with not being able to go to the toilet, feeling stressed, things such as forgetting their homework, which would then add to the stress of not wanting to go to school because they knew that when they got there they might get in trouble, so therefore they were choosing to not go into their forms. And it's just a nice way of figuring out where the pinch points in the day might be for some of these people. Interestingly, on this one, after leaving school, they've written arguing, so it might imply that there's this holistic approach to EBSA, that there's other things going on, not just at school, that might be causing them to have stress when they get to the school setting. So I'm just going to talk you through a breakdown of the focus group transcripts, just so that you can be aware of what the settings were like. There was quite a few, maybe 2 or 3 focus groups that we spoke with who opted out of being recorded. So there's not as many notes as in like direct quotations in there as we might expect, because they were comfortable with speaking to us, but they didn't want to be recorded, but they were happy with us making notes. So just something to keep in mind methods wise for that. So we're just going to summarize what these young people were sort of saying for us. For a small number of students, they were just hiding because they wanted to hide. They didn't seem to have any other real reason that they spoke of for doing it. It's just some of them genuinely thought that hiding from senior leadership teams and running away from them was funny. This was a very small group of students though, but it's just something to keep in mind that for some of the students in this study, there wasn't other underlying reasons that they spoke about for doing so. Lots of the young people spoke about the fact that the reason that they chose to either not go into the classroom or leave the classroom was due to boredom. And a lot of this was because of the content that they were being provided with and the ways in which that content was being provided. Lots of them spoke about the fact that they were made to work in silence, which they found really boring and some found really challenging. And we'll speak about what this might mean for certain groups of students towards the end of the presentation. And boredom was also related to specific staff members. So it was very much, even if you disliked that subject, if you had an engaging teacher, they were more likely to go into and stay within that classroom. They also said that this increased in the afternoon when people were tired after lunch. So they were seeing an increase in children choosing to not go into the classroom later in the day. And then this is a very York way of saying it, but a young person said it's so draining. If they just let us speak, it'd be much more enjoyable. For those of you not from the north, that just means it's boring. It's just a phrase that is very common in the York youth. And then getting a little bit more into what it might be about school that's stressful for these young children. In line with the literature that Nat presented, lots of them were scared about the difficulty of lessons, and a lot of them put a big push on stress and having autonomy for themselves. So for a smaller group of students, a lot of them were scared of the difficulty academic wise of the lesson that they were going into, and this had led to them being quite anxious about being criticised for not getting things right. And this then led to them not wanting to go to that lesson. Again, with everything else that young people have said, this sometimes varied by subject, but also by which staff member it was. So if there had been specific difficulties with a certain teacher or a certain member of senior leadership team, and those relationships had broken down, they were much more likely to try and avoid those lessons, or more likely to leave those lessons once they were in them. And then a lot of the young people spoke about this lack of autonomy, specifically about being able to leave or access toilets. It's the same across the country. Lots of schools try to encourage young people to go to the toilet between lessons, but then sometimes there wasn't enough time between lessons, especially if you're on a split site like there is in York, where you've got a long way to travel between your classrooms, and then they knew that they'd be late for class and then they'd get in trouble for that, so they just didn't go. They just stayed in the toilet. There was also a young person that mentioned the fact that they'd lost a lot of autonomy, and this was linked to COVID a little bit, which I probably should have put on the slides. But I remember there being a conversation about the fact that there was this opt-out culture, but we're trying to teach these young people about consent and autonomy, but then we're not letting them opt out of lessons. And it was a really tricky conversation to have, where, like, yes, you need to have autonomy over what it is that you would like to do, but you do need to engage in your education. And that seemed to have been something that's got much worse since COVID, and since this online space where you could quite easily opt out of things by just not logging on. A lot of them were struggling with that transition back into physical classrooms. And then finally, there was a lot of things around being overwhelmed and wanting to have some sort of privacy. So you're in school for 5 to 6 hours a day, and some of these young people were struggling with transitioning back into that environment and wanting to just go somewhere and be on their own. And that was seen as quite a key reason for a lot of these young people for choosing to not go into the classroom. So we also asked them ideally what they would want us to do to sort of try and fix these problems. Lots of them were asking for safe spaces. So could there just be a quiet space that they could go to? Ideally, that would be somewhere that they could go to without permission. So without having to specifically ask teachers, can I go and cool down in this space? Somewhere that they could just take themselves off to. Lots of them have called for movement breaks. So not just having to sit down in silence and do their work, and they move around the classroom whilst things are happening. And then somewhere for stress relief. So again, this will probably differ across the country, but in York, boxing is quite a popular sport for some of our young people. So they've said if schools could facilitate spaces for us to have boxing clubs or just to hang out with our friends, that would be something that they would find beneficial to getting them back into the classroom. They also interestingly spoke about having better timings for sanctions. So a lot of these young people were well aware that if they misbehaved, then there should be a sanction, and yeah, okay, they should be sent to detention for what it is they're doing. But they spoke about that the timing of delivering this could be better. So lots of them had said, we come into school, we go straight to form, you tell us that we've got a detention tomorrow, and then it ruins my whole day, and I just don't engage with lessons. So lots of them were saying it would be better for them if they were told later in the day that this was happening. They could go home and process it, and they could come in with a better attitude the following day. Lots of the young people wanted a more engagement teaching style. So opportunities, like I said, for movement breaks or to speak, and less silent work. Lots of them thought that having more group work and reduced independent work would be beneficial to them. There's obviously tricky things around there for assessment and what happens when you have to get into individually assessing people's skills. But they thought that group work and presentations and things like that would be a much more engaging way of them learning. They also called for less grumpy staff, and those that were more approachable on a similar level to them, they thought had a much better attitude toward them. They were also really concerned about the fact that a lot of staff didn't seem to want to know what was wrong. So they called for teachers to ask what the cause of being out of lessons was, as opposed to just jump into the defensive and saying, why are you out of lesson? Here's a sanction for doing so. And one young person summed this up by saying that they wanted teachers who believed in you and who gave you a chance. So a big sort of push here on relationship building from the young people's point of view. I think I maybe hand over to Nat now to look at what our teaching staff had said as well.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So I'm going to take us through the online teacher survey. So just as a reminder, we had a total sample size here of 217 teachers from across the UK. And I've broken this down by the question asked. So we had a mixture of a couple of scale quantitative questions and then some open boxes where teachers could expand on their answers. So overall, when we asked how many teachers had witnessed hiding in school, we can see that the vast majority, so 3/4 of the sample, reported that they were seeing this behaviour daily. In terms of those teachers who never saw this behaviour, it was only 1%. So we're seeing here that the vast majority of teachers who were in our survey, and again, self-selecting sample here, they may have been more likely to fill in the survey because they have an interest in this topic or have experienced it, but the vast majority had witnessed this behaviour daily. Next slide, please, Laura. So alongside that, we also asked who hides in school, and we got some interesting responses from this in terms of what the teachers were telling us about who they felt were more likely to hide in their school. The majority of teachers felt that there wasn't really a clear gender divide, that both male and female students were engaging in this behaviour. Interestingly, however, one teacher seemed to suggest that the behaviour was slightly different, in that they said that girls were more likely to hide in toilets in groups, whereas boys were more likely to walk around the site to avoid the lesson. So they seemed to suggest that in their school, with the children, with the young people that they were seeing, that there seemed to be a slight gender difference in the type of behaviours that young people would engage in when they were hiding. Lots of teachers again reported that the behaviour was evident in all age groups, but there seemed to be a suggestion from teachers that it tended to happen more commonly from year 9 upwards, and it tended to be more common in the older year groups. And interestingly, some teachers started to touch upon some of the reasons why they felt children and young people were hiding. So one teacher was nodding to the fact that there may be issues to do with special educational needs, so perhaps ADHD, poor mental health, including trauma and anxiety, and seemed to suggest as well issues to do with home life and also peer pressure, which we'll see come up in the additional questions as well. Related to some of the comments that Laura was making from the student data, is that teachers seem to suggest that disengagement was a strong theme running through why young people were hiding in school, that they tended to be those who were struggling to engage with school. They were more likely to have higher incidences and higher frequency of behaviour incidents. And there tended to be a suggestion that perhaps these young people were those who were maybe struggling and maybe not succeeding academically. So there seems to be a suggestion that there's an academic ability and an engagement issue alongside some of the individual characteristics, which would relate back to those criteria that we saw in the Sussex document earlier on. Next slide, please, Laura. So we tried to drill into a little bit, why do teachers think that young people hide in school? And the responses really clustered around these 5 core areas. First of all, this issue of peer influence. So this idea that young people are meeting up with friends outside of class. They're maybe doing it because their friends do it and they don't want to feel left out, and that they've been very much influenced by issues to do with peer pressure. Interestingly, picking up on this idea that perhaps it's the more powerful or popular person in their peer group who has maybe started this behaviour, and it influences others to engage as well, again for that fear of maybe not missing out. Parental issues came through quite strongly in a lot of the responses, where teachers were feeling that parental attitudes towards education, maybe not pushing young people hard enough, maybe not encouraging young people to follow the school rules, were maybe playing a part into why young people were choosing to not engage in their lessons. But interestingly, again, and tied quite closely to the EBSA literature, is this issue of avoiding challenging situations. So this came through from the student data as well, this idea of being stressed, of being anxious, of finding things difficult. So rather than engaging with something that's challenging, some of the teachers were saying that they found that lesson avoidance and hiding was an easier route. So rather than engaging with the topic that is difficult, missing out that topic, missing out that subject seemed for many of the young people that they were working with to be an avenue, a better choice, shall we say. And then two other points, this attitude towards school again, this idea that they maybe find school boring, they don't find it interesting, it's too hard, they maybe don't like the teacher, and all of these different attitudes can play a role in why young people hide. And finally, this issue of COVID again, this idea that, like with the young people data, that there is an opt-out culture, that young people are choosing not to engage, and that culture has changed as a result of COVID, seems to be a suggestion that's coming through as to why young people are hiding. Next slide, please, Laura. So in terms of COVID, so we just asked the very direct question of, do you think that COVID has had an impact on this behaviour? And the majority here were again saying that very much that they felt that it had been influential in changing the prevalence of hiding in school behaviour. Next slide, please. So in terms of why COVID, again, this idea of opting out, this idea of remote learning, this ties in very much with what Laura was saying again about the data from the young people, this sense that they don't have to do it, they can choose what they engage with, is maybe underpinning some of this behaviour. Related to that is this sense of not really feeling any value in education, not really feeling any engagement or value for what they're doing in school. Related to that was parents' changes in terms of their attitude. So it's not just about how has COVID impacted on young people's attitudes towards education, but it has also impacted on parents' attitudes as well. From one teacher's perspective, they didn't feel as if they were as supportive towards school as they may have been pre-COVID. That maybe there were attitudes there of, okay, well, maybe you don't need to engage because of lockdown. We've seen that it doesn't really matter as much. And all of these sorts of attitudes were coming through in a similar way that parents don't seem to be reinforcing some of the other rules that were in school, such as the importance of punctuality, following uniform codes, all of those types of behaviour. So there seemed to be a theme as well around COVID impacting on parental views of education as well. And then finally, just this changes in routine. So this sense of maybe feeling a bit more anxiety, maybe feeling as if they're struggling with their mental health, that maybe they're not really in a position to engage with their education. So it's just easier to opt out and hide from that lesson rather than engage and deal with something that's a bit more challenging. Sorry, Laura, next slide. So in terms of policies, we also asked a question about, does your school have a policy on managing hiding in school? And just over half of teachers said that they were aware of the policy. In terms of the remaining 44%, it was roughly evenly split between approximately 22% of teachers who were saying they didn't have a policy and approximately 22% who were saying they weren't aware of policy or they were unsure whether or not that they had a policy on how to manage internal truancy. And within that, we asked teachers what was the approach within school to managing hiding in school. And this really clustered around three core themes. This approach in terms of developing sanction-based systems, so dealing in terms of providing sanctions or giving out sanctions if young people were found to hide in school. There was teachers who reported a lot more personalised support, so support from SLT, from teaching assistants, from supportive environments within the school, such as school hubs, who would maybe go and identify those young people who were hiding, give them a quiet and safe space to sit in, do their work quietly, and provide a little bit more one-to-one support in that way. And then there was some teachers who were really saying that their focus has been to try and make their teaching materials as engaging as they can be. They'd obviously recognised that there was maybe some issues there in terms of students who were finding their material difficult or finding it boring. Those of us who teach know what it feels like to have students who maybe don't find their lessons engaging that much. I teach stats, so I face it a lot, but you know, that recognition that you need to make it a little bit more engaging so that people feel valued, they feel included. So there seem to be these three different approaches that were coming through in terms of the approaches that teachers were taking to managing hiding in school behaviour. And then onto what I think is my final slide, just in terms of our final question to teachers was, what do you think are the barriers in managing this behaviour? And I don't think it will come as much surprise that one of the things on here was to do with time constraints, simply not having the time to go and manage this behaviour or to go and find the young people who are hiding in school. So as Laura mentioned, when we were going into school and conducting these focus groups, it was colleagues within the school who were going around the school to find the young people and to bring them in to come and sit with us. That obviously takes time. It's, you know, another resource there. But also some issues to do with inconsistent staff policies, not really knowing how to manage it and what to do, what to offer, and how to really help young people re-engage in the school. Lack of motivation from students, this sense that they're really not engaged, they're not interested, they don't want to be there, which relates very closely to this sense of defiance and disruption. Going back to who teachers thought were hiding, there was definitely teachers who felt there was a cluster of students who had a pattern of problematic behaviour in classrooms, disengagement, often being punished within school, and that defiance and causing disruption in classroom was often associated again with the lack of motivation that we saw. And then finally, and consistent with some of the themes that we've seen on the other questions, not having support from parents. Those changes in attitudes towards education were clearly coming through quite strongly, and that in turn was related to a lack of support in terms of trying to encourage young people to engage in their classrooms and to actually attend and stay in class. So I'll stop there, Laura, and I'll hand over to you.
So I'm just going to give you a very sort of brief overview of what this might all mean in terms of the existing literature and what we found and what we think might help and what we'd like to do next. So consistent with lots of the literature out there, both students and staff were talking about the fact that there's a clear link between a breakdown in relationships and hiding within schools. This was both at a teacher level, so students having a breakdown with a specific teacher and not wanting to go in, but also at a sort of SLT and wider school level. So if young people were having challenging relationships in schools, they were likely to be engaging in hiding more. There was quite a clear link as well between the perceived difficulty of a lesson and children not wanting to go in, and this increased as children got into year 9. And this was exacerbated by people's teaching styles. So there's clearly something going on with how young people are perceiving the lesson that they're attending and anxieties around potentially getting things wrong. And it seems like if this is happening in year 9, there's some sort of link obviously going on to what's happening with going into GCSEs and the additional stress of that needs unpicking a little bit more. There was a bit of a mismatch between what students were saying and what teaching staff were saying as well, which also needs unpicking. There were lots of students who were saying that actually there are genuine emotional reasons behind why I don't want to go into class. These might be linked to anxiety or mental health difficulties that they were going through, or peer relationships. It was actually nothing to do with the classroom itself, but all of these were coming out in a need for a safe space and a place to go and have quiet time on their own. So making sure that staff members sort of understand that, yes, for a small group of young people, they might just be not going to class because they think it's fun to skip class. But actually, there are some genuine emotional reasons that are behind the fact that some of these children are struggling to go into the classroom and stay in the classroom once they're in there. So we've got a few recommendations and next steps for what we think would help. It's clear from both sides that there is some sort of positive to be had if you can build student and teacher relationships. So making sure that there's engaging materials there and that there's a good way of your students understanding what's going on in class, how feedback might be delivered to them, and building these positive relationships to mean that even if young people do find that subject to challenge, they're not going to feel like they might be undermined by teaching staff or put on the spot and things like this. although a lot of teachers in the project in York and across the country nationally were aware of that policy, 44% is still quite a lot of people to either not know what their policy is or to not have a policy in place. So sort of raising this at a policy level and making sure that's implemented across the country is something that might help to address internal truancy. And also helping school staff to understand that there might actually be emotional reasons behind why some of these children are struggling to go and stay in the classroom. So highlighting that it isn't just because of a general disengagement with school. There might actually be something else going on that needs addressing that will then facilitate these young people to go into the classroom. And then in order to do that, it was quite clear that making young people involved in this step, so getting them to co-develop re-engagement strategies with the school, might be a better way of doing this. So instead of school staff just saying, we think this is what will help these young people, speaking to them about what's going on and what it is that might make them feel more comfortable at school and stay in the classroom. So such as these safe spaces or quiet spaces to go to, understanding that they maybe need a little bit longer between lessons to go to the toilet or have a movement break, these things that might help them re-engage with the lessons that they're struggling to engage with. There's also quite a big link between what we found and what the current literature are finding. So these are the references that Nat had put up earlier. So it's quite clear that promoting sort of a whole school approach to this might prevent EBSA. We've done this sort of at a local level. We've shared this with our local authority and people who are working in sort of SEND and public health and things like that. But it's clearly something that needs to be addressed more nationally as well. And it's quite clear that we need to understand this at a school, family and child level. So we said at the beginning that there are some people that are more at risk of engaging in EBSA than others. This was very much done as an opportunity sampling in York, so we can't really speak about those things. So we just got the children and young people that we were able to sort of speak to at the time. It's clear that there's a problem in York and the wider context. So the next steps for us personally are to look at how this actually impacts those groups. So we said there is a bigger problem with absenteeism in special schools. What does the neurodivergent population in mainstream schools look like? Are they also struggling with this more, or is it potentially something that's going on at a school, the way that special schools are set up? So I'd like to myself look at this in a special educational setting, but also as ND students in mainstream, and Nat's interested in looking at how this might play out in those that are experiencing bullying or those that have gone through sort of trauma. And I think that's the end of us. So we've just put our contact details there. There's also a QR code to the report that summarises everything that we've just said, but we're able to share that with you. And I think it's now time for questions, and I think we've managed to keep on time.
You've done absolutely brilliantly. Thank you so much for that talk. And I strongly suggest maybe you could go back to that previous slide in case people didn't catch the QR code to have a read of the report, because it's really interesting and really well set out as well. So we have got a couple of really good questions in the chat, but to start off, I actually wanted to ask a really kind of broad question about this whole issue, because, you know, right at the start, I was thinking, well, you know, it's a really tricky issue, and it must be quite hard to kind of identify this problem in schools and particularly to track the rates, right? Just because of the nature of, you know, children going into school but not turning up to class versus, you know, just not going up to school, where you've got a really clear absence delineation there. It was really interesting, you know, to note that teachers reported that they either didn't have a policy about it or they didn't know what their policy was, and maybe the data thing sort of feeds into that. So I don't know, do you have any sort of thoughts on the issues with capturing the data on this, on, you know, and maybe what can be done about it?
Yeah, Nat, I don't know if you've got anything, but I think from sort of previous experience of working in schools, there will be registers to see who's clocked in at farm time and who's going to what lessons. The challenge there is that adds an extra burden to the SLT for yet more data tracking. So it's something that could be tracked and probably would be beneficial to track, but it's, again, it links into this lack of capacity for time. I think we were fortunate that we were in schools who were very on it and could tell you off the top of their head which kids were the ones that we were going to be speaking to, because they were the ones that were engaging with it. But yeah, I think it's probably something that would benefit from more data, because like you said, there's the data on special schools says that there's a massive problem with absenteeism in special schools, but that's probably quite a different absenteeism to what we're seeing in mainstream, because there might be other health conditions going on that means they can't get into those schools. So yeah, it's a tricky one to unpick. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Nat.
I think just from a measurement point of view, it's really, really difficult to capture, because there's a bit of an issue with questionnaire design as well. Just because I'm toying with this for another project as well. You know, if we were to ask young people of their experiences of this behaviour, it's capturing that effectively and how likely they are to report that for fear of not getting into trouble and all of those types of issues. So I think gathering the data for hiding can be really difficult. And sometimes we had young people who were maybe, I don't want to put a value judgment on this, but only hiding from one lesson. They'd maybe just skipped the one. You know, is that the same as those who maybe just go into one? The behaviour becomes quite complicated to map out. So I think we do need a bit more work around how do we identify this, how do we quantify it, so that we get a better sense of how much of this is actually going on and who's most at risk of it. So I think it's a really good question. Typical response, we need more work on that.
No, it's the honest response, isn't it? So great. So we've got quite a lot of engagement in the chat, which is lovely to see. So our first question comes from Emily, and Emily says, "Thank you for such an interesting and detailed talk. At the start, you mentioned that EBSA may be more prevalent in special schools. Did you include young people with SEND in your study, and were there any differences in how they spoke about their experiences compared to the others?"
So we don't, the honest answer is we don't know, because we wanted to make this as unintrusive as possible for young people. So it's likely that there will have been some neurodivergent kids in our sample, but we didn't ask it at this point. So what we are hoping to do is apply for more funding and look at exactly that. So if we can look at it again in a mainstream context and a special context, are they saying different things? Are there different reasons for why they don't want to go into school? It will be really interesting to see if that link of fear of sort of failing and challenging lessons comes up in that group of people as well, because the ways of them supporting them back into class will likely be slightly different depending on what they're saying. So not at this level, but hopefully soon we'll have some answers.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, you're hoping to do a lot more with this, aren't you? So that's great. So I've got a question from Mary. Mary says, "Thank you for a very interesting talk. To what degree do you think the children and young people hiding in schools are similar or different to those who struggle to attend, so are persistently absent? So do you think the same issues are at play with both groups, or do you think they're distinct?"
Want me to have a go first, Laura, and you chip in after? Yeah. I don't have a lot of evidence at the moment in terms of looking at predictors of the different types of EBSA behaviours. So it's difficult to say with any real certainty at this point. Based on another project that I've done on bullying as a trauma and bullying as a traumatic experience, we see those children and young people who are persistently bullied in school avoid school completely. So they're not going into school at all. And I wonder whether there are patterns of behaviours that are different for those children and young people who can actually physically get onto the school ground, go into school, maybe engage with some teachers, with some lessons, but skip others, feels quite a different experience to those who can't physically get onto the school property at all. And I think that's where we need to unpack this a little bit more. A bit like the early question about how do we identify those who are hiding in school. I think one of the biggest risks with the EBSA literature is treating everyone in the same sort of umbrella term as avoidant or missing everything. And I think if we can start to understand patterns that are associated with hiding from particular lessons versus not getting onto school at all and being completely absent, I think that would be a better position to be in. So sorry, that's not a clear-cut answer, because I don't think we've got the evidence yet, but I think Laura and I both want to unpack this a little bit more to get a better understanding of what's going on, particularly with those who are hiding. So I hope that helps.
Great. Anything you wanted to add, Laura, or should we?
No, I'd agree. I think that unpicking is what we need. So like Nat said, it's really, we don't want to start lumping all of these kids into the same category of saying, well, you're now a school avoider because you're missing certain things. It's like there's obviously some kids who feel capable of going to school grounds, but then can't access certain things, and unpicking that is important for interventions, but also just sort of figuring out what's going on in that school environment. So yeah, annoyingly, another one where we just need to find out a bit more.
Brilliant, thank you. I was just digging around on the internet because Siobhan's question is, can we have the link to the report in the chat? And I think that might be the link. I've just popped it in the chat there, but I don't know if you might want to double check that and point us in the right direction if not. So Michael asks, you've talked about the lasting impact of COVID on student and parent attitudes. Do you think that these will revert to the previous attendance norms as this cohort sort of moves through or departs the education system? So are these attendance issues sort of reducing in younger years, or do you think that these attitudes have kind of changed permanently? It's a hard one, isn't it? Michael always asks the hard questions. I should have warned you.
You should have warned us on that one. I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it similar but different, obviously, to what we've seen in our undergraduate students. And do we see what we perceive to be the impact of COVID in some of our undergraduate students? Do we feel that they'll disappear as well as the non-COVID students finish school and go back? Do we think they revert? I wonder whether some of the lasting issues of, say, working online, more remote, flexible working may play an impact. I remember one of the teachers saying to us that they felt that, because parents were at home and were able to work at home, they weren't as bothered if their child wasn't going to school, because they could look after them and they could do some work at home, if that makes sense. There were the childcare issues associated with pre-COVID, when you obviously had to go to work a lot more. Whether those sorts of behaviours continue to have an influence on attitudes towards education, I think it's something that would be interesting to monitor in the longer term. And then maybe these sort of more negative attitudes, this idea of opting out of education, could potentially fizzle out as well. I think it's a really good question, and I'm going to be honest, I really don't know. I'd like to say I hope they'll change, because teachers are so sure that they're having this influence on hiding in school behaviour, and probably on absence more broadly. But again, I'm really sorry. It's definitely something we need to look at in the future.
Yeah, it's a hard one to ask, because you can't really know for sure until it happens, do you? And we don't know how things are going to continue to evolve. But yeah, no, thank you for that. So this whole thing of culture, this is something that I've noted in my sort of notes, and Anna actually reflects in the chat. She says, we've had a lot of problems with absences after COVID, but we've noticed an improvement this academic year. We've changed our priorities, spend more time chasing absences, sometimes a small marginal change like tracking the data weekly, alerting the parents straight away. And the team of front office secretaries chasing the absences can help. We've had to revert to the culture, which I think is really interesting, sort of moving away from that opt-out thing. I do think there's this really interesting tension, which I'm noticing in education, on exactly what you said, Laura, about, yes, you have this autonomy to opt out, but you also need to engage in this education, in your education. And I heard of this the other day in the context of a teacher who worked in what they call a rights respecting school, which is brilliant. We want students to understand that, they have human rights and their rights need to be respected. But what this teacher was saying is, what's happening is that students are, they're not seeing the bigger picture of why their education is important. And when they're being asked to do things, they're saying, oh, well, I don't have to do this. I don't want to do this. You can't make me because I have rights, etc. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this weird, this sort of tension that's emerging between, yes, I have rights to opt out if it's not what I want to do, versus, yes, you need to engage in your education.
It is a real tricky one, because I found this when we were doing focus groups, because you find yourself going, yes, you do have autonomy, and yes, you should consent, but you need to go to class. And I don't know if it maybe needs to be better put into policy. We see this being dealt with a lot better, or in the special schools that I've been working in recently, they have a better way of dealing with autonomy and when children need a break. So there are children in the school that I work in that can absolutely just pop out for 5 minutes if they need to, and they can come back in and re-engage, and that's seen as as okay in that setting, but that's not seen as okay in mainstream. And I don't mean to pull it back to everything for neurodiversity, but that's just what I'm researching. But we know that quite a large proportion of kids in school now may be neurodivergent. And if we're not changing our actual school systems to support that, then even if we do get them to understand how important education is and you need to engage with it, if they can't physically engage with it because of the settings that they're in, I don't know if that'll ever get better. I don't want to be pessimistic, but yeah, I don't know. I think for me it's a structural thing. Like, we obviously have lots of old schools in Britain, and if children are struggling in the physical settings, then even if we could get them to understand that. But I will talk about neurodiversity forever, so I will hand over to Nat, who will talk about more.
We will talk about bullying at this point, which is a meeting of minds, isn't it? It's interesting because I was talking to a charity yesterday. We were talking about the challenge if you have young people in the same classroom who are engaging in bullying behaviour, and you've got the person who is doing the bullying and you've got the person who's being bullied. And one of the worst things that can happen is that the person who's doing the bullying is sat behind the person who's being bullied, and trying to think about all the complexities of peer relationships, of stress, of well-being, of structure of classroom. I think from so many different research agendas, I think we need to start to think about the layout of our classrooms, the layout of our school. And obviously, like Laura, that's a huge undertaking. Will it happen? I'm not so sure, but I think lots of us from lots of different subdisciplines, if you like, from different research areas are really saying the same sort of thing. There's this standard sit in a classroom for 30 minutes, an hour, depending on the school, and don't move because you're not allowed to go to the toilet either, doesn't suit all children and young people. And, at some point we need to start opening up that discussion and pushing for that discussion to be opened up, to consider other ways of doing things. And in a non-academic way, and I'm really sorry, but I usually do this in my lectures, there's a great teacher on TikTok who talks about and advocates the need for movement breaks, which are common. It's not just there's evidence behind it, but he will take his students out who he knows have diagnosis of ADHD, and he will give them movement breaks and then involve them in class. And his anecdotal evidence is suggesting that type of flexibility is really beneficial. So a more radical change, I think, is needed. Sorry, that was a long answer, but totally agree with what Laura's just said.
No, that's wonderful, brilliant, lovely, full answer to a really difficult topic. So no, thank you so much. There are a couple of questions left in the chat, but as we're coming up to 5 o'clock, I think we will call it there, because that's a really nice place to end it in any case. So thank you so much again, Laura and Nat, for such a fantastic talk. And again, I will invite everybody to read the report, because it's really, really brilliant. Oh, sorry, B is asking, what was the name of the YouTube, the teacher you mentioned?
Astrid, if it's okay, I'll dig them out and I'll share it with you.
Yeah,
and I will
pop
it in, and I will find it and I'll send it to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Nat. Excellent. So yeah, that's the end of our CEN seminar for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your engagement. And next week, our speaker is me. So I'm going to be talking about method issues in evaluating educational interventions. So I will definitely see you all next week. Thanks again. Thanks, Nat and Laura.
Thanks, Astrid.
For having us.
Yeah,
Thank
brilliant.
you.